What are you seeing more generally across the banks at this point?
I am seeing the continued preoccupation of the federal authorities with issues of solvency about 7 years after the world almost ended. And I think it is characteristic of the government to be craning its head backward to worry about things that perhaps are no longer so relevant as the future. The future, I think, is about capacity to earn a return on tangible equity. And yet we constantly read about living wills, about stress tests, and about Daniel Torrillo, the czar of safety. He's the first vice president in charge of closing barn doors after the horses are left. So if you talk to the bankers, we did yesterday, we had our grants conference yesterday.
Yes.
I wish you'd been there, David. It was great. And I talked with Jamie Dimon, and I asked him about the 43,000 people they have on staff to comply with federal regulations, to work with compliance and controls and the like. The 43,000 is like, that's Mets Cardinals in August on a night game where it really matters. It's a lot of people. And so, I don't know, I think these big banks are working in the context of very tight federal regulations, which are bad for them in one way, and another way, they constitute a terrific barrier to entry. So
Jim, when it comes to this quarter of earnings, and
no idea, Vonnie.
No, I know that, but I'm saying one of the preoccupations is what the Federal Reserve is going to do.
Ah, yes.
Now, I pretty much believe that you think the Federal Reserve is going all wrong, but if you were a bank, how would you act in this environment?
Well, see, I asked Jamie, I said, if you would institute legal proceedings against the government for involuntary servitude, you would count on the editorial support of Grant's Interest Rate Observer. He seemed not interested. If you're a bank, of course you have to comply. He said emphatically that he was no longer going, he is not going to fight with the United States government because they got the A-bomb. He's not going to do that. That's for a journalist to do, and we should. But the banks, of course, must comply. The regulators have something, have powers that are all the more emphatic because the rules are not quite set. So if you don't know what the rules are, you have to be extra nice to the people who decide. So, how much stock can you repurchase? How much can you pay out in dividends? You don't know until you go and as a supplicant.
Christine?
So one question I would have is, there is sort of a view some investors have, and some question whether regulators have it as well, that maybe the simplest way for the banks, the big banks, to reduce their regulatory burden is to get smaller, to break up.
Well, that is one approach. I submit to the consideration of the vast Bloomberg TV audience the paradigm of yesteryear, in which the equity holders of a bank were responsible for the solvency of the firm. Up until not so long ago in the history of the world, you got a capital call if you're a bank holder if your bank became impaired or insolvent. They came to you for additional capital. No more. The taxpayers rather get the capital call in the extreme case. There's only one financial institution in New York City that is modeled upon the old way, and it was conspicuously not insolvent during 2007, 8, and 9, and that's Brown Brothers.
Right.
So the general partners are on the hook for their entire net worth, debts of the firm.
So, Jim, I suspect that if Dan Torrillo were sitting right here right now,
he's not, David.
But if he were, I'll try to channel a little bit. One of the things he would say is, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is make sure that the U.S. taxpayer is not the ultimate backstop for the banks. And so by doing this regulation, we're going to ensure that if it does go wrong, the equity holders will pay the bill rather than the U.S. taxpayer. That's what he would say, I think.
That is the intent. But the way they go about it, it seems to me, is command and control rather than through the price mechanism and through the responsibility of individuals. We have gradually and by degree, over the course of decades, moved away from individual responsibility in finance, from the partnership model to the model of state control. So we have now 6 or 8 too-big-to-fail banks, which increasingly are creatures of the state, or they are still too big to fail. They are cartelized. We have a cartelized financial system, much on the model of unhappy countries in Europe. And David, it's high time for a change. We should revert to capitalism.
Jim, there's things you can't regulate, and one of those things is
mercifully
a load of banks going out there and issuing a load of money, given a load of money to a lot of companies to go out there and drill some holes and extract oil. And the theme we've seen over the last couple of days is provisions just increased. So the correct read for Wells Fargo for the first quarter provision for credit losses, $1.09 billion. You can't regulate that. Are you worried about the consequences of that in the months and years ahead, though?
Well, with a specific question of oil, it seems to me that the future is going to be one of a bull market in oil. So I think these provisions are eye-popping, but I think they tell more about yesteryear's decisions than they do about tomorrow's prospects. So I think that credit is the recognition of loss in credit is, of course, a lagging indicator.
Yeah.
And yes, just as you say, if you give enough Texans enough free money, they will drill enough holes in the ground to constitute, to bring to the surface the fatal marginal barrel of oil that's going to collapse the price.
Jim Grant, you're sticking with us. Christine Harper, thank you very much for your time.
Jim Grant, take us through your analysis. We're not talking about bank regulation now. We're talking about monetary policy. It is their job to set interest rates, right? What should they do?
Less.
Less as in no moves.
Well, I think that they should do less of almost everything they now do. I mean, they pretend to things they can't know, and they undertake actions that are mainly unhelpful. I say this because the Fed seems to conceive its principal work to be suppressing or distorting the free play of prices. Interest rates are prices. And one thing that we mostly can agree on is that over the course of millennia, price control has shown to be an unwise public policy.
So what would be the move they would make or not make to do that, to let the prices rule? Because if you take a look at the inflation rate, it's not 0.25%.
No. The Fed controls pretty much one interest rate only, the very short-term overnight rate. Other rates it influences heavily. It seems to me the Fed has missed its market. It had 6-7 years in which to orchestrate a return to something like normal interest rates. And now the Atlanta Fed is showing at a contemporaneous GDP reckoning that the GDP is scarcely growing. So the Fed is now confronted with the possibility of moving to restore something like a normal structure of interest rates at a moment in which the economy is perilously close to contracting. So it's not a happy position for the Fed, but stepping back, I would say that what the Fed ought to do is less, meaning it ought to intervene less. It ought to get out of the way of the asset markets. It ought not to try to institute inflation at the rate of 2%. The Fed conceives as its remit doing something to create a rise in the general level of prices at 2% a year. Why? They call that price stability. That is called inflation, as at least a layman might conceive of 2% a year.
Jim, you mentioned the horse bolting earlier when we were talking about banks. The horse has bolted, hasn't it? They can't close up the communication shop now.
They can. Well, we have what a friend of mine, Seth Lipsey, calls the verbal dollar. They talk and talk and talk. Yesterday, Kevin Warsh, who was an alumnus of the Fed, who was kind of in it but not really of it, he's a very effective critic of it now, and he says, apropos of listening to the noise, he says only one voice matters, that of Janet Yellen. So the Fed, Mr. Lockhart's going to have something intelligent to say because he is an intelligent man, but he is not as we used to say, the decider during the Bush administration. That is Janet Yellen. But the Fed chases these data. It is data dependent. The data are not what they are represented to be. They are prone to revision. They are first guesses. They are backward looking. There was a book published some decades ago by Oscar Morgenstern, a great economist, and it was called On the Accuracy of Economic Observations. And he was merciless in his skewering of people who would take at face value the emissions of the data mills.
The lesson from Jim Grant: cut through the noise, listen to Janet Yellen. Jim Grant, founder and editor of Grant's Rate Observer, thank you very much.